In 1905, a French laborer who was living in Switzerland named Jean Lefray shot his pregnant wife, then his 2 daughters, and then tried to kill himself. The newspapers blamed absinthe, the wormwood spirit that was supposedly driving all of France insane. What they didn't mention was that Lefray had also consumed 7 glasses of wine, 6 glasses of cognac, 1 coffee with brandy, and 2 creme de menthe before opening up the absinthe bottle. But absinthe got the headline, and within a decade, it was banned across the Western world. This is the story of a plant that was framed, and a cousin in the same genus that went on to become one of the most important medicines in human history. I'm Megan Brame, and on this episode of The History of Plants, we're following Wormwood from the oldest medical text ever written to the cafes of Paris, from a corporate conspiracy to a century-long ban, and from the Book of Revelation to the city that shares its name. And this plant's rap sheet goes back a lot further than a Parisian cafe, like 3,500 years further.
Hey, Future Megan here. Just wanted to pause for a second and give credit to Barnaby Conrad III for his wonderful book, Absinthe, History in a Bottle. If you want more details on it, I definitely recommend checking it out. It helped me so much in my research phase of this episode. Okay, back to it.
The genus Artemisia contains roughly 500 species that are spread across every continent except Antarctica. But the one we're focusing on today is Artemisia absinthium, common wormwood. It's a perennial in the Asteraceae family, grows about 2 to 4 feet tall, and has these distinctive silvery green leaves covered in fine silky hairs that give the plant an almost like ghostly ethereal appearance. Crush the leaves and you get a pungent, deeply aromatic scent that's sort of sagey, sort of cedary. Taste them and you'll understand why the Greeks named this plant absinthium, which translates roughly to undrinkable. It's one of the most bitter plants you will ever encounter, which is why it was often mixed with sugar cubes, but we'll get to that later. Artemisia's name stems from the Greek goddess Artemis, goddess of the hunt, wilderness, and childbirth. However, Pliny the Elder credits the name to Queen Artemisia II of Caria, a naval commander and botanist who built the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though the queen herself was named for the goddess, so either way, it circles back to the same place. The English word wormwood traces to the Old English wermod, and while the exact origin is debated, the name stuck because the plant's most celebrated use across cultures was as an anthelmintic, a substance that expels intestinal worms. It does what it says. The German cognate Wermut gives us another word you probably know, vermouth. So the next time you order a martini, you're drinking something named after a medieval deworming herb. Now, you're welcome for that image. And here's a name that's going to come back later in a way nobody saw coming. In Ukrainian, the common name for a related Artemisia species is Chernobyl, meaning black stock. The first written evidence of wormwood in medicine comes from the Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical scroll dating to approximately 1550 BCE, and is one of the oldest preserved medical documents in human history. Among its 842 remedies, the papyrus prescribes a bitter plant for digestive complaints, fevers, and intestinal parasites. What's probably no surprise to those who dabble in Egyptian history is that these physicians demonstrated a ridiculously sophisticated understanding of what they were working with, recognizing that bitter substances stimulated appetite and aided digestion, a mechanism that modern pharmacology didn't officially validate until researchers discovered bitter taste receptors distributed throughout the human digestive tract at the turn of the 21st century. But that's not even the biggest breakthrough modern researchers have found. More on that later. The Mesopotamians were using it too. The library of Ashurbanipal, a collection of 660 medical texts dating back to the 7th century BCE, documents bitter aromatic herbs for digestive ailments and ritual purification that are consistent with the Artemisia species. By the time we reach the classical world, wormwood has a full resume. Hippocrates prescribed wormwood wine for jaundice, rheumatism, and menstrual complaints, while Dioscorides cataloged 33 distinct medical uses for the plant in his De Materia Medica 5 centuries later, covering everything from stomach complaints and liver ailments to intestinal worms and ear infections, while warning that undiluted wormwood juice was bad for the stomach. Pliny the Elder, frequent guest star of this series, documented 48 wormwood remedies in his natural history and recorded that the champion chariot racers of Rome drank wormwood potions, presumably because winning a chariot race on a bitter stomach felt like earning it. The Roman poet Lucretius used wormwood as a philosophical metaphor in his poem De Rerum Natura, writing that physicians would coat the rim of a cup with honey to trick children into swallowing the bitter medicine, observing that, quote, They are tricked, but not trapped, for the treatment restores them to health. The idea that difficult truths must be sweetened to be accepted is apparently as old as wormwood itself. In the Hebrew Bible, the word la'ana appears 9 times, 7 as a metaphor from bitterness and twice as a proper noun, and is generally translated into English as wormwood. The phrase gall and wormwood from Deuteronomy became a standard English idiom for extreme bitterness. And in the book of Revelation, chapter 8, verses 10 through 11, a great star falls from the heaven, and its name is Wormwood, and it poisons a third of Earth's waters. In the Greek translation of the Bible, that star is called absinthos, the same word that gives the plant its Latin name. That apocalyptic imagery will resurface in a context no one writing Revelation could have predicted, so stay tuned. This is a crazy episode. Through the medieval period, monasteries became the custodians of wormwood knowledge. Hildegard von Bingen, the German abbess, mystic, and herbalist, called it a master herb for digestive and respiratory complaints. Charlemagne's Capitulare de Veliis, written around 800 CE, required wormwood in every royal estate garden. Monks scattered it on floors to repel insects, hung it on doorways to ward off evil spirits, and burned it during burial rites to guide souls safely into the afterlife. Shakespeare used it twice, to devastating effect. In Romeo and Juliet, the nurse recalls applying wormwood to her nipple to wean baby Juliet, which is sadly a well-documented period practice. In Hamlet, when the player queen vows to never remarry, Hamlet mutters wormwood. Wormwood. I'm not an actor, sorry. But it's the bitter commentary on his mother Gertrude's betrayal. By the 17th century, wormwood had become so synonymous with bitterness that the word itself functioned as a one-word verdict on the human condition. Slavic folk traditions, wormwood was burned during Ivan Kupala night, the midsummer festival that I talk about in the 10 Mythic Plants episode of Alchemica Botanica, to drive away restless spirits. Travelers carried it for protection on the road, and in some traditions, it was considered the only defense against rusalki, the malevolent water spirits who lured travelers to their deaths. All over the world, different species in the same genus were also getting their moment in time. But I don't want to veer too far off the track of our Artemisia species here. Suffice to say that this one genus shows up independently in Egyptian scrolls, Greek philosophy, Roman poetry, Hebrew Bible, Christian apocalyptic prophecy, medieval monastery gardens, Shakespeare's plays, Chinese emergency medicine, Slavic protective rituals, Native American smudging ceremonies, and East Asian acupuncture. 500 species found by virtually every medical tradition on Earth. And all of them arrived at the same conclusion: this plant matters. And then someone figured out how to pour wormwood into a glass, and that's when things went sideways. For most of its millennia-long medical career, wormwood was respected, feared, and swallowed reluctantly. Nobody was ordering it for fun, but that changed in the late 18th century when someone figured out how to make that bitterness beautiful. The earliest known advertisement we have for an absinthe product appeared in 1769 when a woman named Suzanne Marguerite Henriot marketed her Bon Extrait d'Absinthe in a Neuchâtel newspaper in Switzerland. The legend typically credits a French doctor named Pierre Ordinaire, who was living in exile in the Swiss village of Couvet around 1792, with developing a formula that combined wormwood with 7 other plants in a 136-proof alcohol, though the Honoroy sisters may have gotten there first. Either way, the formula caught the attention of Major Daniel Henri Dubier, who purchased it in 1797. His son-in-law, Henri Louis Pernod, established the Pernod Fields distillery in Pontarlier, France in 1805, initially producing 16 liters a day. And that would eventually scale to over 30,000 liters daily. The spark that turned absinthe from regional Swiss curiosity into national obsession came from an unlikely source: the French military. During the Franco-Algerian War of the 1830s through 1847, French soldiers were given absinthe rations to purify water and prevent fevers. It worked, or at least it seemed to, and the soldiers acquired a taste for it. When they came home, they brought that taste with them, and Parisian cafes were happy to oblige. Then, something happened that transformed absinthe from a popular drink into one of the era's most dominant spirits. Between the 1860s and 1880s, an aphid-like insect called phylloxera devastated European vineyards. 2/3 of France's grapevines were destroyed, so wine production it collapsed. The country that defined itself by its wine suddenly didn't have enough of it, and absinthe, which required no grapes or vineyards, stepped into the void. By 1910, France was consuming 36 million liters of absinthe annually. The wine industry, ever petty, no offense to wine people watching this, if you are, watched this happen, and they did not forget. This is where the ritual comes in. And remember those sugar cubes I mentioned in part 1? If you've ever seen 9 Inch Nails' The Perfect Drug video, Be Still's my little teenage goth heart. This is what Trent's doing. A specialized slotted spoon was balanced across the rim of a glass containing a measure of absinthe. A sugar cube was then placed on the spoon. Then, ice-cold water was dripped slowly over the cube, dissolving it into the spirit below. As the water mixes with alcohol, a compound called anethol comes out of the solution, and the clear green liquid turned an opalescent milky white. That transformation is called the louche, and it became one of the most recognizable visual signatures of any drink in history. Ornate absinthe fountains, custom glassware, and hand-forged spoons became collector's items. And that daily ritual of preparation performed in cafes across Paris during the late afternoon became known as l'heure verte, the green hour. And the drink itself earned a name that would outlast every attempt to kill it, la fée verte, the green fairy. The list of famous devotees reads like, a entire roster of Western art and literature. Oscar Wilde reportedly said, quote, after the first glass of absinthe, you see things as you wish they were. After the second, you see them as they are not. Finally, you see things as they really are, and that is the most horrible thing in the world. Vincent van Gogh was a heavy absinthe drinker, and some art historians have linked his consumption to xanthopsia, a condition that tints vision yellow, which may have influenced the vivid palettes he's famous for. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec reportedly drank 6 bottles daily and carried a hollow cane filled with absinthe so that he was never without. Edgar Degas painted L'Absinthe in 1876, depicting 2 hollowed-eye figures at the Café de la Nouvelle Athènes in a scene so bleak it caused a scandal when it was exhibited in England. Baudelaire, Verlaine, Rimbaud, Hemingway, Picasso, Manet, the list goes on. For a generation of artists and writers, the green fairy was the muse and was the medicine and was the method. But that love affair came with a growing backlash. By the late 19th century, a medical diagnosis called absinthism had entered the vocabulary. Doctors claimed that chronic absinthe consumption caused a distinct set of symptoms beyond ordinary alcoholism: seizures, hallucinations, cognitive deterioration, and moral decay. The temperance movement, which was already campaigning against alcohol categorically, seized on absinthe as a uniquely dangerous target, and they found powerful allies in an industry that had every reason to want absinthe gone. Remember phylloxera? By the turn of the century, the French wine industry had recovered from it. Vineyards had been replanted and production was climbing. But absinthe still held a massive share of the market that wine business owners considered rightfully their own. The wine lobby poured resources, no pun intended, into an anti-absinthe campaign, aligning itself with temperance advocates and medical authorities to frame the green fairy as a unique public health menace, something completely different from wine, which was conveniently marketed as wholesome and natural. And then they got their case. In 1905, Jean Lefray, the same man I told you about at the top of this episode, murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters. The newspapers reported that he had consumed 2 glasses of absinthe. What most of the coverage failed to mention was that Lefray had also consumed, like I said, 7 glasses of wine, 6 glasses of cognac, 1 coffee laced with brandy, and 2 creme de menthe before absinthe. How he was standing, much less murdering people, is incredible. Because by any reasonable standard, this was a case of extreme alcohol abuse. But it was the absinthe that made the headline. And then the dominoes fell fast. Switzerland banned absinthe in 1910 via a constitutional referendum, and the United States followed in 1912, though just by regulatory ruling, so not as hardcore as the Swiss. France, the country that had consumed 36 million liters a year at its peak, banned it in 1915. The green fairy was dead, killed by a combination of moral panic, corporate lobbying, and a murder case where the actual evidence pointed everywhere except where the public was told to look. And if that's your kind of history, subscribe because I've got plenty more where that came from. But here's the question that lingered for almost a century after the ban. Was it true? Was there actually something in Wormwood that made absinthe more dangerous than any other spirit? Or was the whole thing a setup from the start? The answer was sitting in the chemistry, waiting for someone to bother looking. So was absinthe actually guilty? For almost a century, the answer seemed obvious. Doctors had diagnosed absinthism as a distinct condition. Governments had banned the drink, and the active compound that everyone pointed to as the culprit was Thujone, a molecule found in wormwood's essential oil that, at high doses, acts as a GABA-A receptor antagonist. That just means that it blocks the neurological receptors that drugs like benzodiazepines activate to calm you down. Block those receptors aggressively enough and you'll get convulsions, seizures, and in extreme cases, death. Alpha-Thujone is about 3.3 times more toxic than beta-Thujone, and both are present in wormwood oil. So, on paper, the case against Thujone looked pretty solid. But the thing is that no one had actually tested it. In the early 2000s, a New Orleans microbiologist named Ted Bro decided to do what a century of moralizing had somehow failed to inspire. He analyzed the actual drink. Using gas chromatography mass spectrometry, Bro and his colleagues tested 13 authenticated bottles of pre-ban absinthe produced between 1895 and 1910, the exact era when absinthism was supposedly destroying France. I would love to know how he got those. I love thrift stores. I have never seen bottles of absinthe lying around, much less 13 of them. The results were devastating to the prosecution. Average Thujone content across those bottles was 25.4 milligrams per liter. To put that in perspective, at that concentration, a person would die of alcohol poisoning long before they'd consume enough Thujone to experience any neurological side effects whatsoever. In 2006, researchers Padoche, Lachenmeyer, and Crohn published their conclusion. Absinthism was a, quote, fictitious 19th century syndrome indistinguishable from chronic alcoholism. The seizures and the hallucinations and the cognitive decline, all was consistent with what happens when you drink 136 proof alcohol in large quantities over extended periods. The Thujone was a scapegoat and the plant was framed. And the people who framed it had a motive. Those petty-ass French wine industrialists, devastated by phylloxera and desperate to reclaim market share from the spirit that had replaced it, had funded and amplified the anti-absinthe campaign. The temperance movement provided the moral cover, while the Lanfray case provided the headlines. And Thujone, a molecule that most people couldn't pronounce, let alone understand, became the villain. It was one of the most effective smear campaigns in the history of food and drink, and it worked for nearly 100 years. But look, the chemistry of wormwood goes far deeper than Thujone and bitterness, and this is where that breakthrough I mentioned in part 1 comes in. Absinthin is the primary bitter compound in wormwood, and it's in a class called sesquiterpene lactones. It activates a specific bitter taste receptor called HTAS2R46. Sexy name, I know. And that activation is the mechanism behind wormwood's ancient reputation as a digestive herb. When those receptors are triggered, your body responds by increasing bioproduction, stimulating gastric secretions, and priming the digestive system. The Egyptians knew this worked 3,500 years ago. Modern pharmacology finally explained why in the 21st century, when researchers mapped bitter taste receptors throughout the entire digestive tract, not just the tongue as we had previously thought. But the real striking modern research involves something the ancient world never tested for. In 2007, a double-blind placebo-controlled study tested wormwood in patients with Crohn's disease, one of the most difficult inflammatory bowel conditions modern medicine deals with. During the trial, patients received 500 milligrams of wormwood 3 times a day. And the results were that 65% of the wormwood group achieved complete clinical remission. The placebo group, 0. A follow-up study in 2010 measured the inflammatory marker TNF-alpha and found that levels dropped from 25.5 to 8.0 picograms per milliliter in the wormwood group. That is a massive reduction in systemic inflammation from an herb that most of the Western world had written off as a poison. The antimicrobial research is pushing into territory that might matter even more in the long run. Specific phenolic compounds in wormwood, particularly, I'm going to butcher this, 4,5-diocaffeoylquinic acid, has been shown to inhibit efflux pumps in Staphylococcus aureus. That's kind of high level. Sorry. All it really means is that some bacteria survive antibiotics by actively pumping the drug back out of their cells before it can kill them. Wormwood compounds can block those pumps, essentially locking the door and trapping that antibiotic inside the bacterium where it can do its job. The antibiotic, not the bacterium. In an era where antibiotic resistance is considered one of our most serious threats to global public health, a medieval dewormer that restores the effectiveness of failing drugs is kind of the discovery that deserves way more attention than it's getting, don't you think? Beyond that, wormwood extracts have demonstrated antifungal activity, antioxidant effects through flavonoid and phenolic acid profiles, anti-inflammatory activity in animal models, and insecticidal properties that are being explored for commercial biopesticide development. A company called Ecoflor Agro has been investing in scaling up production of specific wormwood chemotypes for use as a natural pesticide, an idea that monks had figured out centuries ago when they scattered the stuff on their floors to keep the bugs away. So, all right, here's where we stand. A plant that has been used medicinally since the pharaohs was poured into a drink and became the muse of an entire artistic generation. But it was also accused of causing madness, framed by a competing industry, and banned across the Western world for nearly a century. So when researchers finally got around to examining the evidence, it turned out to be innocent of all the charges, while quietly holding compounds that might help fight superbugs and put Crohn's disease into remission. The question is, did anyone ever set the record straight? Yes, someone did set the record straight. It just took 73 years. In 1988, the European Union issued a directive that re-allowed wormwood as a flavoring agent in alcoholic beverages, provided Thujone levels stayed below 35 grams per kilogram. It was a quiet regulatory change, but it cracked the door open. The real breakthrough came from Ted Brough, the same microbiologist whose analysis of pre-banned bottles had demolished the case against Thujone. But Brough didn't just debunk the myth, he used his research to develop his own absinthe brand, Lucid, formulated to replicate the authentic pre-ban recipes that his lab work had proven were never dangerous in the first place. On March 5, 2007, Lucid received approval from the U.S. Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, becoming the first genuine absinthe legally sold in the United States since 1912, 95 years. That's how long the ban lasted in America, and the plant it was based on was innocent the entire time. Today, approximately 200 absinthe brands are produced worldwide. The ritual is back. The slotted spoons and sugar cubes, and fountains, the louche, all of it have been revived by a global community of enthusiasts, bartenders, and historians who understand that what they're drinking was never the villain it was made out to be. Modern regulations cap Thujone content at 35 milligrams per kilogram in the EU and require less than 10 parts per million in the US, thresholds that authenticated pre-banned absinthe would have comfortably met. The Green Fairy was welcomed right back into the fold. And here's something that surprises a lot of people. You can grow wormwood yourself completely legally. Artemisia absinthium is a hardy perennial that thrives in poor, well-drained soil and full sun. It's drought-tolerant, deer-resistant, and once established, borderline unkillable. It's even available from mainstream seed companies. I'm actually trying to grow it right now, and I say trying because my seeds haven't germinated yet, which is a little humiliating, considering that this plant has been successfully cultivated by Egyptian physicians, medieval monks, French distillers, and basically every civilization on Earth. And I can't get it to sprout in a grow bag. But I'm working on it. Meanwhile, wormwood's role in modern herbalism has been quietly expanding beyond the bar. Contemporary practitioners use it as a digestive bitter, typically as a tea steeped for 5 to 7 minutes and consumed once daily for no more than 2 to 3 weeks, in small cups about 15 to 20 minutes before meals. The European Medicines Agency has formally recognized traditional wormwood preparations for short-term treatment of appetite loss and mild digestive complaints, which is the regulatory equivalent of saying the monks were right. There are contraindications. Pregnant and nursing individuals, anyone with a seizure disorder, and people on certain medications should avoid it entirely. But for the general population, the plant that was once accused of destroying minds is now officially recognized as a legitimate digestive aid. And then there's the name that's been hanging over this entire episode. You thought I forgot about it, didn't you? Or maybe you forgot about it. Look, someone may or may not have forgotten. Let's move on. In April 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine suffered a catastrophic meltdown, releasing radioactive contamination across an enormous area of Europe. It remains one of the worst nuclear disasters in human history. And the city's name, Chernobyl, derives from the Ukrainian word Chernobyl, the local name for a common Artemisia species that once grew abundantly in the region. After the disaster, a prominent Russian writer pointed to the book of Revelation, chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. Quote, "And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters because they were made bitter." A New York Times article by Serge Schmemann published on July 26, 1986, reported the connection, and the story spread worldwide. Today, the town features a Wormwood Star memorial depicting an angel blowing a trumpet, which directly references the prophecy. Whether you see that as coincidence, irony, or something else entirely, it's hard to imagine a more fitting next chapter for this plant. Wormwood has been on the record longer than most civilizations have existed. Accused of things it didn't do, credited for things it did, burned in burial rites and scattered on monastery floors, poured into glasses and banned by governments, invoked in scripture and whispered in folklore. It was framed by an industry, acquitted by a microbiologist, and it's still here, growing in rocky soil and disturbed ground the same way it always has, bitter and beautiful and apparently impossible to kill, unless you're me, in which case the seeds still haven't germinated. Thanks for watching. If you want to check out the commentary, receive ad-free 4K episodes, and see the research that didn't make the cut, that's all on Patreon, and your support there is what makes these episodes possible. So thanks to everyone who's already part of it. But if you're looking for your next rabbit hole, check out the opium poppy episode, the flower that built pharmaceutical empires, fueled wars, and created an addiction crisis we still can't escape. Till next time, Greenies, stay curious and don't forget to flourish.